When it comes to improving our photography, we often focus on just a few areas: our creative vision, our technical and processing skills, and our gear. Those are all very important, but they're missing one critical thing, and that's you. Welcome to Pixels. I'm Beth Bilo, and I'm so glad you're here with me to explore the heart and art of photography. My guest today is Alister Benn. We talk about what it means to bring your full self to your photography, how he evolved into creating more autobiographical images, and what role context and story play in how we present our work. Alister Benn is a renowned landscape photographer, educator, and author, celebrated for his innovative approach to night photography and expressive, minimalist landscapes. His work often emphasizes mood, emotion, and the intimate connection between the natural world and human experience. Through his artistic and educational endeavors, Alister has inspired photographers around the globe to connect deeply with their craft and the natural world. A very special thank you to my video editor extraordinaire, Alex Armitage, and Nick Stover of Nature Photography Classes and their Inspired Creator Grant, which is a partial supporter of this channel. If you have a creative idea you want to get off the ground or expand, you can learn more or submit your own application at naturephotographyclasses.com/inspired-creator. Let us know in the comments what you find interesting, meaningful, useful in this conversation. And of course, your likes and shares are welcome. We'd love to have you subscribe and make sure that you are notified of future upcoming episodes. And with that, let's get to the conversation. Hi, Alister. Welcome to Pixels. I'm delighted to be chatting with you today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, what is making you smile?
That sounds like the type of thing John Barclay would ask.
I know.
Life makes me smile. I'm grateful and happy every day, really. So nothing in particular. I live in a beautiful place. I have a beautiful wife. I've got the perfect job. I'm healthy. It's all pretty good.
Yeah, lots to be grateful for.
Yeah.
Tell, where are you in Scotland?
We live on the Isle of Lewis, which is an island about just short of 3 hours ferry off the west coast of Scotland. So it's pretty out there in the North Atlantic. We're just over 58 degrees north, so we're quite far north. And we moved out here in May. So we've lived on the mainland until this year, and then we finally bit the bullet and moved out to the Western Isles. So it's amazing. We really, really love it out here.
What is most surprising to you about being out there on the island?
That's a good question, actually. I thought I knew the place until I moved here. And the area of coast nearest home isn't. I thought I knew quite a lot about that coast, but I've discovered a lot more. So I think when you move out to somewhere as remote as this, you always fear the worst in terms of the community that you're going to join. You know, whether they're going to be a little insular or they're not going to welcome you, and that is the opposite. They've been incredibly welcoming to us. But that's an excellent question. I need more time with that one, I think.
Yeah, cool.
No, I'm worried about the rest of this.
You should be. No,
I am. I'm terrified.
Well, it's kind of funny. I mean, I don't mean to digress, but just you saying that, like 3 hours by ferry from the mainland, and I think about, we have a family cottage that's 18 miles on land from a little city. And I worried, like, when we talk about, like, maybe we retire out there, I'm like, oh, that might feel too isolated.
No, I wouldn't worry too much about that. No, half an hour in the truck is not a problem.
No, it puts it all into perspective. So I really appreciate that. Well, now that I think about it, I don't know what the date of the blog post was, but at least 20 years that you have been focused on landscape photography and doing workshops and teaching and that sort of thing. So congrats on that. And what do you feel like is the most meaningful piece of wisdom that you have now that you didn't have then?
Oh, man. I think looking back, my ego was a huge part of my early
Mm.
development. I wanted to be recognized as good. I thought it was important to be recognized as good. When I first started out with landscapes, anyway, because I was a bird photographer first, so it was about
Mhm.
3 or 4 years of bird photography exclusively before I got back into landscapes.
Mhm.
And my first landscapes that I took back then were very free spirited. I would literally just point my camera at things that I thought were cool, without any regard really for any classical composition theory or anything like that. And
Mhm.
I then started to listen to critics who said, oh, well, you can't do that, or you shouldn't do that, or it would be better if. And I then spent the next 15 years trying to become perfect in the eyes of the outside world, and got pretty good at that.
Mhm.
And But I didn't feel a lot of great ownership for those images, because they became quite repetitive and a little bit sterile. So from about 2016, 17 onwards, I've kind of reverted back to my older approach of just pointing my camera at things were cool. So yeah, I think that would be my most, if I were to be able to talk to my former young self, it would be
Yeah.
do what you feel is right and don't be too concerned about what other people think of it.
Yeah, lovely. I think that's a conversation similar to what I had with Cole Thompson
All
recently
right.
about ego and how much that plays a role in our development of as art as creatives, in
Well,
general.
I mean, in life,
Yeah, yeah,
it's
yeah.
just in every aspect of our lives. Yeah, ego is a slippery snake, not to be
Yes.
welcomed into our abode.
And, maybe I'll toss this out to you because I tossed it out to Cole. Ego, it seems like there's two sides to it. One is that it can stop us because if we are using our ego to lead and be validated by others, like you said, like, to follow the rules and be accepted and sort of fit that conventional look. That's the ego we want to avoid. But yeah, ego also is what allows us even to be sitting here having this conversation and to say, I have something to share. I want you to look at this. I want to communicate something. Um, how do you? I'm wondering, what comes up for you when I say that, and what your
Yeah,
thoughts are on that dance.
I don't consider my reasons for being here egoistic, in any shape or form, and I don't think a desire to share or communicate or to educate or to express my feelings about creativity or expression are necessarily egoistic either.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
I think they can be,
mm-hmm.
and there are plenty of people out there who beat their own drum quite passionately, and are lacking in a certain amount of humility. Whereas for me, I think experience comes with age and wisdom comes with age, I suppose. And like you say, I've been doing this for a while, and while I'm not trying to say that I am somehow better in any shape or form, I have learned a thing or two over the last 25 years. And I do think about it to a fairly deep level. So
Mm-hmm.
I think I've come to some realizations that have proven to be useful to the people who I have taught or teach.
Yeah, yeah.
So the role of ego, I think, is more easily identified when people are using it to bolster their self-worth. When they're
Mm-hmm.
making photographs and external validation is needed for them. With my photography, external validation is the smallest part of my whole process. It's not that I
Mm-hmm.
don't care what people think. It doesn't change my relationship with the work.
Yeah,
And I won't
yeah,
produce work just to tick somebody else's boxes. And I think
yeah,
that's really
yeah.
where, when we start to produce images to please other people, without much care or consideration for our own needs or wishes, I think that's when ego is a negative impact.
I agree. And you said a word in there I just want to pull out, which is useful. And that's a word I found myself using more, like I want to be useful, and putting ourselves out there, teaching, sharing information, sharing wisdom, sharing images. There is a way of looking at that and saying that I'm being useful to someone else,
Yeah,
useful to the advancement of something.
I think when you're running a business, but I've been running various photographic businesses for quite a long time now. So we are surviving and prospering. So we're obviously doing something right. I was talking to my wife about it the other day, and to me, it's like bartering. It's providing a service in exchange for money. It's a very simple. I have something of value in here that might help somebody else, and they pay me money to get it. It's as simple as that, really. It's like exchanging a chicken for a 2 loaves of bread. It's no different.
Yeah.
If people want to pay in chickens, that is also fine.
But chickens don't pay the rent, but they at least fill your belly.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, what do you feel like is the biggest question you still have, like as you embark on the next 25 years?
For me, creativity is, I think, I'm more that's a big question in many ways, because there's so many different facets that I could answer it from, from a personal level, from a business level, from a health level, from all of these different things. I'm certainly not interested in accolades or awards or recognition of my work. Any beyond what has happened already. The biggest question that I have moving forward in terms of what might happen for me, personal development is more important. I think I'm much more interested in how I develop as a person moving forward, and the work that I produce, be it written or photographically or verbally, is always going to be a reflection of that. So I find myself in a stage in my life now where I'm simplifying and stripping down and focusing on the things in my work that I truly enjoy rather than have to do. I'm pretty much getting rid of all of the things that, I have to do that, but I don't particularly enjoy doing that anymore. So things are definitely simplifying, and I'm a huge meditator. I spend a lot of time meditating, and that is revealing things that were unexpected, I guess, moving forward as well. So I think as my practice there deepens, the alignment with the teaching and the personal development and the creative development work is going to become, just generally just sort of that feeling of more sort of synergistic, that it just all feels like it's just all me. So personal life, private life, public life, business life, really all just kind of fluid into one, really, I suppose. I'm not sure that answered your question, though.
Well, it was, like, what are you going to be asking yourself, or maybe it's kind of like, what's the mystery that you are leaning into as you do this meditation, as you do this,
I don't think there's any mystery at all. I think, and that's why I found the question about ego so interesting, because ego is I'm just not interested in it in any shape or form, So I think the great mystery is how I managed to live so long being so stupid. Would probably be I'm not so much worried about moving forward. It's looking back that embarrasses me.
Interesting.
I'm happier with the decisions I make today than perhaps the ones I made 20 years ago.
Yeah. Well, that's that wisdom. And as you said, the shifting relationship with your ego has made that possible.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, fingers crossed. So it's sort of like, how long can I keep this up?
Yeah, exactly. It's Yeah, we're not the smartest sometimes.
True. I will definitely grant you that. Well, you just recently did your first photo book,
I did.
titled Out of Darkness. Yes. And it's not quite showing up, but I will make sure that we have that we let people go. Whoop, there we go.
There we go.
Beautiful. And I know we'll be taking a look at a few of the photos from that, I believe. But it seems like that's a visual representation of your own journey from experiencing decades-long depression and panic attacks and anxiety and into what you call a more balanced and accepting life, which I think
Yep.
we've already heard some
Yep.
evidence of as we've been talking. How did you just come to discover that creativity and even specifically photography was part of the gateway? I don't know if it's the gateway, but part of the gateway to healing for you.
Oh man, you're good at this. I think a lot of us can be really slow learners when it comes to our personal lives. I think many of us excel in our business lives. My former career, before photography, I was quite successful, and we deal with all of those things flawlessly and seamlessly. We get problem after problem after problem, and we just knock them down like Skittles. And in our personal lives, we tend to do a lot of chucking band-aids over them and worrying about just saying, oh, well, I'll deal with that eventually type of thing, or it'll go away. And for me, photography had become a negative thing in my life. By 2016, I was almost at the point of quitting. And the only reason I didn't is because I had to get a proper job. It was probably the thing that was like, oh, well, no. I had a successful business and stuff, but photography didn't seem to have it become a problem for me. And I think the Gobi was an opportunity, the Gobi Desert, that is, was an opportunity to rediscover a utility in photography that I hadn't really appreciated. And the distinction really is that if you create images using societal norms as a framework, or using other photographs that you have seen and liked as a framework, then you don't actually learn anything. All you're doing is painting by numbers, really, in a way. You're just laying varying content over this kind of template. I don't think anybody finds that satisfying in the long term. And really what I found was, and it took until I had a mentor, a guy called Jeff Bannon. He's kind of a creativity, I'm trying to think of the right word, something that he won't hate me for. He's like a guru. He's like a creativity guru. He works with a bunch of creative people, and he reached out to me and offered to work with me pro bono. And he used to get me to visualize, like close my eyes and visualize negative things in my life, to identify them and to create form and shape. And it wasn't really until I did that exercise that I really started to join the dots with my photographic work, where if your unconscious is driving, if your subconscious or your unconscious is creating images, I found that I would surprise myself a lot more that way. And once you're surprised, you're engaged, you're intrigued, you're kind of wondering, well, where did that come from? And why did I do that? And why did I do that instead of something else? And yeah, I just started looking at all of my images that were made in, I'm not going to call it a flow state, because I think that's a bit kind of, it's been churned around a bit too much, that whole concept of being in a flow state. But if you're not consciously following templates, then I think photography can open doors to your unconscious or your subconscious. And that to me was a hugely liberating avenue to go down, because I instantly, my photographs just became really autobiographical. When I looked at my own images, it was just like telling a story of my mental states or my emotions or my inaccurate perspectives. And I coined a phrase, which is, we're the most unreliable narrators of our own perspective, because our brains are just full of judgment. They're full of our beliefs and values and preconceptions and things that just get stuck in your head that you believe 100% because you've always believed it to be true. And they're not true. And I think as soon as I started to dissect all that stuff, and I did a lot of meditation during that time, and I write about it in the book, meditating during panic attacks and stuff like that. And it's horrible. I mean, I wouldn't wish it on anybody. When you get through to the other side, you realize how much of these things are just labels and perspectives. And labels and perspectives aren't real. And as soon as you realize that they're not real, it's almost as if literally it's just they evaporate. And I went through an incredibly fast metamorphosis from being an extremely depressed, panicky person to being who I am now, which isn't.
Yeah.
And it was like that. I mean, it was almost as if, someone had sprinkled pixie dust over me, and it was better. It was very odd.
Yeah. Well, and you did, it sounds like, a lot of work. I mean, in terms of that meditation, introspection, and you were willing to do something that a lot of people aren't, which is to move past that. I'll think about that later. I'll do that tomorrow. I will deal with that another time, and confronted those assumptions and limiting beliefs, and all of that snowballed, it sounds like, into allowing you to have that, to inviting that awareness.
Yeah. I'm a firm believer that anything in life worth anything, it should be hard work. I think if things are too easy, they don't have value to you. If you work at them and you really feel like you've put in 100% effort, then all of a sudden it's like, okay, yeah, that was worth it.
Yeah, it clicks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this idea of, I mean, I am someone who has had, decades long depression on various levels and have gotten a handle on it. And I've spoken with others, so I know we're not alone, obviously, but if someone is watching this and this resonates, I kind of come back to that word wisdom, I suppose, but what can you offer in terms of, I suppose, encouragement or guidance, I guess?
It's very difficult, actually. I've spoken to a number of people about this over the last few years, and it's a question I get, quite a lot. There should be an easy answer, and everyone wants an easy answer. The hardest thing for anyone who's in that mindset at that time is to believe anything outside of that mindset. We get so entrenched in our own opinion, our own evaluation, our own coping mechanisms, our own belief that nothing will make it better. We get so convinced that whatever medication we were on, or whatever drugs we want to take, or however we want to cope or deal with it, is the only way. And we do a lot of self-identifying as depressed, as panicky.
Yes.
And of course, there are mental disorders that require decades of therapy and some fairly serious drugs to deal with. Not all and this is something that's really important to say, is that not all mental health issues are imaginary and trivial. Many of them are
absolutely.
not. However, there are many people who identify themselves as being depressed who when something really good happens to them, very, very quickly, they're not depressed anymore. And that's not clinical, that's emotional. So I think identifying where you fit on that spectrum is a really good thing to do. Is this clinical and medical, or is it emotional and behavioral and psychological? Obviously, if you're in the former camp, you need proper medical professional care. If you're in the latter camp, where it's mostly emotional, psychological, and behavioral, and trauma, things like that,
Mm-hmm. Yes.
childhood, adult trauma, sexual abuse, all of those types of things can be hugely impactful in our mental health as we get older, because we repress and we bury a lot of these things from our younger years. But a lot of that can get better really fast. I think my best advice would be very careful about the language we use to describe ourselves.
Yes.
I would say that the more you self-identify with negative self-image, the more likely you are to manifest that negative self-image. I've got
Mm-hmm.
a little saying, which is your amygdala is listening. Yeah. So
Yeah,
every time you say something
absolutely.
negative, your amygdala listens and it learns, and all it
Absolutely.
does is reinforce that negativity. Even simple mantras like, I am not my thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds such a trivial little thing. And the problem is nobody believes it. You
Yeah.
know, everyone who is depressed and panic stricken does not believe I am not my thoughts, because you
Right.
are 100% your thoughts. I read something really cool the other day, which actually I thought was really important, which is there's a very clear distinction between self and self identity. Self is something that
Mm.
we think of as real, when
Mm-hmm.
in fact it's not. And self identity is something that's really important. So, if self identity is the thing that's the most important, how we describe our self identity and how we think of ourselves as people is fundamental, because that is the thing that's kind of manifest in the world and
Yeah.
interacts with other people. The self is just a bunch of atoms spinning around
Yeah.
temporarily.
Yeah. Temporarily. As we're all too aware. You're making me think of a saying like, don't believe everything you think.
Right.
um, and how it is challenging sometimes to challenge those thoughts and to recognize I am not, like, as you put it, I'm not my thoughts. Um, so
the,
yeah,
the, the
thank you.
world the world is always going to invent new ways to make us sad.
Yes, this is true. This is true. Well, and our brains will believe it.
Yes, and some of them are sad, but
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's also what I have found, another mantra that helps me is act as if.
mhm,
And so if my amygdala is listening and hearing, I'm depressed, it can also hear, I am healing. I am
right,
moving towards something. I am capable. I am
yeah,
strong, So to start to, we can't ignore the gremlins.
mhm,
Um, but we can start to talk back to them and say,
yeah,
you don't have to be the boss of me.
right, and get angry with them and shout at
Yeah.
them and rage at them. I did the same thing. I had really chronic back pain for 7 months of last year and had sciatica and could barely walk. I
Mm.
mean, it was really quite
Oh,
alarming for 7 months. And I used to get furious at myself,
yeah.
shouting at my brain to stop making me suffer. And eventually it
Hmm.
did. I
It did
woke up,
listen.
yeah, I just woke up one morning and I could run 10K again. It was great.
Oh my. Wow.
It
Wow.
was
Well,
awesome.
that's the power of
Yeah,
our relationship to ourselves and the stories we
absolutely.
tell ourselves, you
Yeah.
know.
And,
So
and yeah, I kind of look at myself as my own cheerleader a lot of
yes,
the
that's what
time.
we have to be.
Yeah.
That's that's what we have to be, because nobody's going to do it for us.
Yeah, I mean,
And
obviously, some of us do have people who love us and support us and care
yeah,
for us and all of that type of stuff, but the world doesn't really care that much about
no.
our images or our self-esteem or the
Mm-mm.
value of our work and all of that type of stuff.
Right.
But yeah, you gotta, we only get one spin round, so
Yeah.
yeah, we gotta make the most of it, really, I think.
Yep. Absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing that, because I
No
have a
problem.
feeling that that's going to be useful, helpful to anyone who might
Hope so.
be feeling some similar things or having experienced that. So let's look at some of the images we've been maybe talking about. I want to start out with these pivot pixels that represent some sort of shift in your journey. So okay, so tell us about what we're seeing here in this beautiful scene.
So this image and the next image are both part of a series that I called Music from Dark Spaces. And I made these in October 2018. My mental health at the time was really poor. I mean, we're seriously, seriously poor. I mean, I was Googling things like, what is the point of life? I mean, it was like that
Yeah.
bad. It was really awful. I started making these photographs and I'd gone through this process post Gobi Desert. And really, I talk about this in the book, identifying the attributes of the landscape and what they were kind of representing. And, so how can this image be autobiographical? Well, it's dark. So if we think about dark images tend to provide a stage for highlights to play on. So a dark image, obviously, it becomes about the highlights. The highlights are the melody of the tune that we are going to hum along to. So in this particular image, obviously, the beautiful autumn leaves and the beam of light going through the trees are representing hope and positivity and courage and things like that. You'll notice I think every image I sent you was a square. I do love a square.
Yes, I did notice that.
I'm a big fan of square images. It's my favorite format, really, I think.
Well, I was going to ask, what about it is appealing to you?
Well, any aspect ratio except a square emphasizes one dimension over another. So width over height or height over width in varying relationships. So you look at something like a 65 by 24, a panoramic, an X-pan panoramic image. All of those are expansive and they feel grand, even if they're intimate, because you have to read them from right to left or left to right.
Right.
A vertical image will make the content feel varying degrees of tallness. The more pronounced, a 3x2 vertical is more pronounced height than a 5x4, and a 16:9 is even more pronounced. So think about Japanese ink scrolls. They're tall and thin, and they all feel heavenly because there's an ascension in them. So the aspect ratio has a huge psychological impact on the viewer and the artist. And the thing with squares is that you're not emphasizing height or width. What tends to happen is you go from corner to corner. So if you're right-handed like me, you tend to start in the lower left-hand side and make your way up to the top right-hand side. And almost nobody would look to that top left-hand corner if you're right-handed. Whereas if you're left-handed, you're more likely to go up into that top left-hand corner. So square aspect ratios just feel very solid. They just feel very balanced because you're not emphasizing height or width. And I think you can stick anything in a square, as I will demonstrate with the rest of my images.
Yes.
You can pretty much stick anything in there and it's going to feel as if it looks right. This image or this series of images was the start of my autobiographical photography, I think. Even though had been making images prior to that, some of the Gobi images were actually before this, but this was where my life and my work were just absolutely in sync. The images were narrating my story, I guess.
What is your philosophy on sharing that story with the viewer as opposed to letting the image speak for itself and be interpreted by the viewer in the way they want to?
I think both work. You can share an image on its own and, that's like giving someone a short story with great levels of complexity in it and not giving them any clues as to what's going on. If there was a bunch of the author's notes that went along with a story, it's like, let's take a simple book like Lord of the Rings, one of the most famous books ever written,
Simple?
right? Well, yeah,
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
it's a simple story.
It is
essentially a simple story, but the metaphors and the subtext within that, Tolkien's experience in the war, the fact that all of his friends had been killed, his relationship with good and evil, all of those types of things, and then obviously the Norse legends and that type of stuff. Once you understand the context to which that story was written, it takes on a whole new dimension. So essentially, any photograph is, when it is stripped of backstory or context, it's just a photograph. It's just a photograph of a tree in some quite pretty light, or sand. I'll tell you a funny story about that later on. It's just a tree. It's just tree in nice light. That's all it is. That is the depth of its story. Now, photographs, like paintings, especially modern art, abstract paintings, the more the viewer can contribute to that narrative with their learning, their insight, their emotional bandwidth, their emotions, their feelings, their spectrum of experience viewing art and understanding art, the more they're going to get out of that piece of work. Yeah. So photography now has become so disposable, so transient, so impermanent, so devalued through social media. You just have to log into Instagram and you're just bombarded with tens of thousands of photographs every day. How can you appreciate art on this? How can you appreciate a piece of work with the width of an iPhone? Other phones are available.
There are.
Apparently so. So you know that when people look at your images on social media, they're unlikely to be too bothered about too much of that kind of stuff. It's like, oh, that's nice, double tap, give it a heart, move on, Whereas thankfully, by the time someone's invested in a book, they're more likely to spend some time reading the text, looking at the images. And then, of course, in particular with the book, the images and the text are of one voice. They're just twins. The images tell the same story as the text. It's just not very obvious. It's not. Of course, we are a spoken society. We use language to communicate. We don't draw pictures unless we're playing Christmas games. Pictionary or whatever it is. We use language because it's so much more efficient. Now, if someone else looks at this photograph with sensitivity and openness, it's going to be a mirror to them, and I think photography for me is the landscape holds up a mirror to me, and I find myself in the landscape and I point my camera at the bits that kind of whisper to me. And the same when a final photograph, that's holding up the mirror to the viewer. I like to give clues. Obviously the book is way more explicit. It is a story. With images like this, I think even on the website, I've got a very brief amount of text with them. It's not huge, so I'm prepared to go down both of those routes.
I I find I say this a lot on this podcast where I don't want to dig into AI and all of the philosophical and practical ramifications of it. And what I'm always listening for and looking for is why AI won't replace us, i.e. creatives, photographers, etc. And what you just described is what gives me hope.
Right.
It's the story, it's the personal connection, it's the meaning that is infused that is not there when it's machine created.
Yeah, and I think more often than not these days, people want to go out and have their own experiences and make their own photographs.
Yes.
And perhaps if they were going to buy a book or buy a print, then, they would like to know the story behind that photograph and why it was made and what it meant to the person. And I think that's obviously going to be way more meaningful to a human than a computer just thinking, well, this is somehow a pretty photograph of a tree with a god beam.
Right. Right.
It's just, it just becomes a description of an aesthetic. It doesn't become anything beyond that. There is no
Yeah.
intelligence, there is no creativity. It's just another algorithm. I've had enough of those.
Exactly. Exactly. Let's take a look at the next image, which is also rather magical.
Taken on the same day, same morning, within minutes of the previous one. Just a little bit more abstract, less literal, I suppose. Harder to love, I think, from an external point of view.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps that I'm fascinated by the concept of barriers. One of the things that really helped me overcome the kind of mental health side of things was looking on my brain as having created a cage for myself.
Mm.
Yeah, a cage where every negative language that I'd ever used to describe myself had created a bar in that cage. And those bars become a barrier. They become a barrier between our true selves and our ability to escape, really, from this self-imposed prison, I suppose. So I'm fascinated with barriers, and I think photographically, I'm really interested in barriers. So photographing through something
Mm-hmm.
always feels like an interesting approach aesthetically, because by using a long focal length and photographing through another tree with the little drops of water on the branches, created this very atmospheric and sort of diffused barrier that adds quite a lot. Now, if it wasn't there, I think it would still be quite a pretty photograph of the other tree, but with it there, it definitely takes it to a different. It asks the question, well, why did he do that?
Yes.
um,
Yes.
as opposed to, oh, it's a photograph of a tree in nice light.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. It
Yeah.
felt. I like looking through the viewfinder and playing with bokeh. That's something I do like
Yes.
to do a lot. A friend of mine, Astrid, is super good at that. She's so
Mm.
good at just photographing nothing, but
But making it magical
she knows
somehow.
what I mean.
Yeah. 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 Well, and you're reminding us about one of the reasons I think story can be powerful is that it shares about that intention that we have seeing through. And I look at this and I can almost feel like I can reach through the bars.
Yeah,
So it has a similar feeling of hope to me as
good.
I look at it.
Yeah, I mean, I like to think of atmosphere generally as a hopeful attribute,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
usually.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to hear about this one. This is a transition, I believe, to the desert.
Yeah, so this was the cover of the book. This is one of my favorite photographs. I'm really happy with it. I went to the Gobi Desert 7 times, and this was somewhere in the middle, maybe the fourth or fifth time I was there. And you get to the point where you think, I've done this.
Mm.
You've kind of photographed it every which way, the dark and the moody and the light and the airy. And I'd climbed up this really high dune above the camp, in the dark before dawn, and had made a few photographs in the sort of twilight. And then just as the sun was starting to come over, just above that is the horizon, basically. And just as the sun was coming over, it just got glaringly bright, all of it. It just got suddenly incredibly intensely bright. So this is just eliminating all of the sun, but leaving the flare at the top. And because the dune itself was still in shadow, it was incredibly blue
Yeah.
relative to the warm light of the sunrise. There's not a lot of processing being done on this. It's really not that far out of what I was experiencing at the time. But yeah, it became the cover of the book. Out of Darkness seemed like a logical title.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, you mentioned, you've been to the Gobi Desert, multiple times, and we're wondering, like, what is there new? How do you approach visiting a place that you've been over and over and find a way to be there in a new way?
I do that a lot, really closer to home. I mean, I run workshops here in Scotland, for example. I've run a couple here on the island in the autumn here. And I was thinking about it the other day, actually, because I took a group to a beach just like 2 weeks ago, and we stayed there the whole day. You know, we
Mm-hmm.
got there at,
Mm-hmm.
just after round about sunrise, and we stayed until sunset. I think we were there for 8 hours at the same
Wow.
beach. We stayed there for 8 hours, and it was the first time I'd ever done that in a workshop. And the thing about this beach is it goes on for like 2 kilometers, a mile, over a
Mm-hmm.
mile. It was just, I mean, I must have been there 60, 70 times, and I was finding things that I'd never seen before. So
Mm-hmm.
I could guarantee that the people who were seeing it for the first time, there was no shortage of things for them to discover. The thing about it is that when we think about it in real terms, the person who I was yesterday doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
So
Yeah.
the person I am today is really just a different person that can go to that same location. And if we grow and we mature and we open our minds and our hearts and look at the world through less judgmental eyes, then you're always going to see something new. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so in the desert, for example, I'm off to Morocco in January for 2 workshops and going into the Sahara. And I can't wait to get back into the desert. It's just such a cool
Yeah.
place to go and make photographs. Anyone who's been to Death
Yes.
Valley or
Mm-hmm.
Namibia or, some of the other big sand dune type places, any desert like that is just, there's no end. And my best approach in places, all places really, is not to worry too much about the end product.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm not thinking about sitting back at my computer. I'm not thinking about how I'm going to process it. I'm not thinking about, oh, I'm going to make a series of images from this, or it's going to become part of this portfolio or whatever. I want to be there and I want to be present. I'll point my camera at things I think are cool. And that's what photography is for me, really. So yeah,
Yep.
I mean, every photograph I've shared with you is just something I thought was cool.
Yeah.
And I think I've said before, composition is pointing your camera at the cool and eliminating everything that isn't cool.
I love that. That's a very, yeah, clear, concise, and to remember. To me, it's like I take away from that like what's cool. It's like what's cool to me.
Right.
To not be thinking about what's going to be cool to the gram or
Right.
Facebook or whatever.
Yeah. And what you might actually find cool that you didn't think you might find cool
Yes.
is, and I think this is where expectations is always going to be a
Mm-hmm.
killer. You go out there expecting, it's like anyone who goes to the desert expecting a certain type of photograph is almost certainly going to be disappointed unless it
Yeah.
does exactly what they expect. And nature doesn't give a damn.
No,
It doesn't
it
care.
doesn't. It does not
Um,
care.
so I think landscape photography is the greatest teacher of equanimity out there.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Well, you're making me think of, I believe it was during my conversation with John Barclay that we were talking about comparison and that quote, comparison is the thief of joy. And
Yeah,
I thought expectations are the thief of joy.
right. Yeah.
Being attached to them is, yeah, that's a
And,
joy
and if you
killer.
think about it, comparison and expectation are the same thing.
Yeah.
Your
Mm-hmm.
expectations are by nature, you're going to compare what is there to what you hoped was there. So it's all
Yes,
comparison. It's that kind
it
of,
is.
yeah. So comparison is also expectation.
Yeah, yeah, good point. And you're reminding me also something you said before that stood out was about if you're surprised, you're engaged,
Yeah.
and to allow yourself to be surprised will get things moving.
Yeah. It was Sting that came out with that quote.
Mm,
I watched an interview with Sting, and he was saying music should surprise you. He
yeah.
said, if you start listening to a piece of music and it doesn't surprise you in the first 8 bars, it's probably not going to surprise you.
Mm,
And I
mm-hmm.
think it's the same with photography. Photography should surprise us. I think it's
Yeah.
you know, otherwise it's just another photograph of a sand dune.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Yeah. And this is It's so silky. I'm just,
Yeah, it
I'm
always
just
reminds
so
me of like
taken.
rippled velvet or something, like velvet
Yeah.
material that's been kind of folded and rippled.
Yeah. It's really magical.
Thank you.
I would love to hear a little bit about this particular image. And then I've got some other questions that I want to make sure I have time for, but maybe tell
Sure.
us about what we're seeing here.
Uh, I have no memory of making this photograph at all,
Hmm.
but I did. It's on my hard drive. Um, it's. I think this is where surprise comes in again.
Mm-hmm.
It's processing can alter contrast. We know that. A raw file, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, if you expose to the right, everything's going to be washed out and very, very explicit. And this was a file like that. The raw file was really quite bright. There was still, of course, I mean, I haven't altered it. I haven't put in anything that wasn't there. This is obviously just
Mm-hmm.
a very quickly processed raw file, but it has been darkened a lot
Mm-hmm.
from what was captured in camera, because obviously you're going to capture detail. We don't underexpose our shots by 3 stops typically, but this is what this is. It's essentially underexposed in processing by at least 2 to 3 stops, and then you just lift the highlights again. So it has become much, much more contrasty because it's stripping it down. And this is the same as the first image that you showed, where a dark stage provides an opportunity for the light to be the only story.
Mm-hmm.
It's the details, the textures in the big raw file or the big original TIFF file. You can see loads of beetle trails everywhere in the
Oh,
sand. There's just
yeah.
millions of beetle trails just crisscrossing the sand. So there's just a whole universe of life going on in that little few square meters of sand. And again, I think, you look back on, whether it's Shakespeare, all the world's a stage, that is all a frame is a stage. It's a,
Mm-hmm.
it's a stage, and we are players on that stage, and light is a player on that stage. So when I make a dark image, it's really because the light is the key. And there is a very faint diagonal in the print. I actually, on the deluxe edition of the book, or sorry, the collector's edition of the book, this is one of the prints, and there's a very, I actually reprinted it dozens of times to make sure I could just get the right amount of detail in the foreground. There's just this tiny little wash of color, which is slightly different from the back. But yeah, again, it's just a simple photograph where it's a very quiet statement, really.
Yeah. And it seems to reflect your statement before about I pointed my camera towards something cool. I take that and then I strip away the things that
Right.
detract from that so that I'm keeping the viewer's focus and imagination on what attracted you in the first place, which was that beautiful sliver of light.
Yeah, it's weird. I find this one really playful.
Mm-hmm.
It's I have an interesting sense of humor. I can be quite cheeky, and I find this quite a cheeky image.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Mm-hmm.
kind of mischievous.
Yeah, a little impish here. And I'm looking at the left edge, and granted, I'm looking at it on a screen, smaller and whatnot, but it almost looks like there's sand that's blowing.
Yeah, there is. It was
Is
really
that,
windy.
yeah. And
Yeah,
that adds to it for me. It gives this sense of life in a different way.
yeah,
Um,
movement.
exactly,
Yeah,
exactly. And I find that really lovely. Yeah, thank you. And
thank
we'll be
you,
sharing other images that you shared with me in the video so that
thank
folks
you.
can get more of a sense of that out of darkness. But I wanted to I always have this goal of trying to maybe make my interviews a bit more concise, but then phew, there's like so much. So I always end up reining it in. So I'm going to rein myself in. But I do want to ask you about your business name, Expressive Photography, and how you describe what expressive photography is.
This is a really interesting question because One thing I'm very keen not to do is to make expressive photography some tiny niche that is like a dead end down the last cul-de-sac. It's a kind of,
Hmm.
you just end up down there and that's it. You're only stuck with expressive photography. I think any photography, any and all photography can be expressive. And I think it boils down to two things. One is the awareness of the person who made the photograph. How aware are they of how the image feels? I think expression
Mm-hmm.
is more about feel than words. The words are always going to fall short because I don't think there's a one size fits all definition for each individual person. Some people are more analytical, some people are more emotional, some people are more naturally artistic, some people are just more technical. And where does expression fit with technical photography, for example? But it does, because
Mm-hmm.
it's expressing their true nature. Some people are just technical. And if it's expressing technical proficiency, then that's what it's expressing. So for me, it's that awareness of the person's relationship with their own work. And then secondly, it's intent. What's the
Mm-hmm.
intent of the person? Is it, going back to the ego question, is the intent of the person just to impress and win over with technical skill? Or is it the intent of the artist to provoke, to challenge, to question, to articulate something that, and one of the things I always feel about it is, and maybe this is me just making myself feel better, but I always think of sharing an image as a somewhat altruistic thing, or it can be an
Mm-hmm.
altruistic thing. It's like saying, this is what this means to me. This is how this helped me. And perhaps it might help you by
Mm-hmm.
understanding. So the genesis of the book, as an example, most of the feedback I get from people who email me after they bought the book is, you know, that it was an incredibly powerful body of work that has helped them to gain insight and perspective on their own lives. And
Nice.
that transcends pretty photographs any day of the week. That
Mm-hmm.
transcends winning an international award in my
Yeah.
book. Yeah, it's
Yes.
way more
Yes.
important to me. I think expressive photography is understand what it is you're expressing. Is it awe at a beautiful view? That's expression. Awe is an
Mm-hmm.
expression. Or does it go down, my particular avenue is obviously that autobiographical aspect. My work is me. It is a deep reflection of who I am, and every image I produce is autobiographical. So I'm just expressing myself with photographs instead of expressing myself with words or a book or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I think they're the two attributes that I think are the most important.
Yeah, nice. Well, and this goes along with something else that you state, particularly your intention with the workshops, which is to support people in creating more personal and unique images. And you even talk about like pushing the envelope. Would you say a little bit more about what that also means to you?
I'm not a big fan of envelopes and cages and boxes.
Mm-hmm.
All of that language, thinking outside the box, I'm done with that. Just don't have a box.
Right, right. Why do we need a box?
Yeah, get rid of the box. Get rid of the box,
Yeah.
and then everything is outside the box. There is no box. So I think the thing with a lot of photographers, particularly people who come in workshops, the very fact they're on a workshop and they've forked out quite a lot of money to come halfway across the world to join me in wherever it is we're doing them, it means that they've had a certain amount of success in their lives. They've been
Yeah.
good at something. They've been good at their
Mm-hmm.
career. And of course, we get so many people from all sorts of different diverse backgrounds, but most of them are doing pretty good at something, or they have done very good at something. And the thing with that is that people who have done well throughout their lives don't like to fail.
Yes.
We recognize failure as part of our growth, but we still don't enjoy it. We still don't
Right.
look for failure. And I think anyone who's achieved anything in their lives typically when they pick up a camera or a guitar for that matter, it's like, by God, I'm going to be good at this. I've gone out and spent all of this money on all of this equipment and I'm going to be good at it. So they put a lot of time and effort into it. And the problem with that is that most of the learning material encourages people to do X, Y, and Z to be proficient. And the problem with doing X, Y, and Z is that everyone is doing X, Y, and Z. And therefore all of your images look the same. And I just don't see the point in that. It's like me picking up a guitar and all I ever play is Smoke on the Water or Stairway to Heaven. If
Right.
It doesn't matter how many guitars I've got or how much money I spend on them. If I only play those few chords, what's the point? It's no value to the world at all. So I think what I do encourage people to do is to say, well, who are you? Who are you as a photographer? Who are you as an artist? What do you have to say? The kind of analogy I tend to use is, imagine knowing every word in the English language. Imagine knowing the entire dictionary. You would say that you have all the technique available at your fingertips to articulate yourself. But if you don't have anything to say, if you've never had an original thought, all of that language is a kind of pointless, really. And it's the same with photography. Having the best equipment and using all of these fancy techniques with masks and layers and selections and all of these things that people do are using increasingly more expensive and powerful computers. It doesn't make your images any better. No one cares, So I think aesthetics is way more important than anything else. So for me, encouraging people to notice what they get excited about, I think, is probably the most important thing. If people want to go and photograph the view, they don't need me. if that's really what people want to photograph, they don't need to pay me to do that. So I'd rather, I talk a lot on workshops. I'm sure people are sick of it. As you've experienced this afternoon, as soon as you ask me a question, you get an awful lot more than you were hoping for.
Oh no, I get lots of lovely things I was hoping for. So yeah. Well, and I believe you've answered one of my closing questions, which is, or you've started to provide seeds for a closing question around, like, how can we maybe challenge ourselves or do something? The way I like to put it is, like, do something today that our future creative self is going to thank us for.
I think my favorite expression would probably be, you got to do you. You've got to do you, but that is one of those expressions it's almost like a Buddhist koan. It's paradoxical in its very nature, because, well, who am I?
Right.
Is the first question. And I think that's what I've spent the last 20 years trying to figure out, is who am I? The answer surprised me, I think, and it continues to surprise me. And that kind of answers your question from earlier on, is, what's the big last question, and I think that ultimate question for me is ultimately, well, who am I? Who is that going to be in 20 years time, for example? It might be really, really interesting I'll definitely, I'm motivated to stick around.
We're going to do a 20th anniversary conversation to find out what you learned.
I'll just check my diary. I might be busy that week.
Exactly. Oh.
I think for people to be free, one of the things I get a lot at the end of, like, giving a talk or a presentation at a conference or something, is people coming up to me and saying, I'd just like to thank you for giving me permission to be me. And I say, well, you don't need my permission, and I always find it kind of quite poignant and a little sad that someone's had to wait for permission to be them. So I think I'm definitely a big fan of another favorite expression, which is, what's the most excellent thing I can do today? It's the way
Mm.
to start
Mhm.
every single day. I open my eyes
Mhm.
and it's what's the most excellent thing I can do today. And talking to you was one of those answers from this morning. It was just like, great, I get to do
Yeah.
this and I get to talk and, have this conversation. So that was something really, really cool. And I did a couple of other things that were really, really cool. So what's the most excellent thing you can do today is, well, you can
Mm.
start by discovering who you really are,
Yeah.
and be ruthless. You
Mhm.
know,
Mhm.
all of this examining the language, examining the beliefs and the values that we have to what we think of as our identity. You know, don't do this on serious mind altering drugs, of course. That's
That's
probably
right.
not.
Yes, there. I have had some friends who have done mushroom, like mushroom kind
Psilocybin.
of psilocybin, yeah, guided experiences, and have had some rather interesting insights.
Yeah, I mean, and potentially huge insights
Yeah,
because there's nowhere to hide under those
right.
circumstances. And this is what we do is we hide from the truth about who we
Hmm.
really are. And I think it's so important for us to not to delay with that.
Yeah,
If you're going to do anything today, then being honest with ourselves and having a pact with ourselves that, right, today I'm going to be really honest with myself. And okay, if that's, if we ran ourselves like we ran our businesses, things would be way more efficient.
this is true.
Right.
This is
Right.
true.
Oh, that's spam. I'm just going to delete it straight away.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah.
I have fun with all of this. I mean, I know that I can be a little bit frivolous with it sometimes and stuff, but it's only because it makes me giddy kind of thinking about it.
Yeah. Well, I was listening to one of your videos, and you talked about play and how we often, dismiss that. And I'm a fan of bringing it. Let's bring play back,
Totally.
because it's part of that gateway. And when you were describing those early years when you were picking up the camera, and without regard to rules and all of that, was
Mm.
play.
Yeah.
And now you're getting back to it, which
Right.
is,
And that's what I do with the guitar. I pick up a guitar and I
yeah.
play. I literally, I
Hmm.
mean, that's why they call guitar playing.
Playing.
Yeah. You know,
Exactly.
photographic
Exactly.
playing. I'm playing with my
Yeah.
camera. So
Yeah. Why not? Like,
we take it all very
lighten up.
seriously. Yeah, lighten up. We take it
Yeah.
very seriously.
Yeah. Well, what kind of, I've been asking my guests recently, if there are any resources, photography related or not, that you find yourself recommending repeatedly that people find useful.
All my ebooks.
Of course. Okay. Yes. So we should say the ebooks, workshops, Out of Darkness,
uh,
all of the things.
all of that stuff. I oddly enough, I the only photography related material I read are photo books. That is all
Hmm.
I read. I don't read blogs. I don't read um, social media.
Hmm.
I only read photo books. So
Hmm. Hmm.
if photographers I admire release a book, I buy the book. My wife is an avid photo book collector. She has hundreds of photo books.
Wow.
And that's what we do. We spend our time looking at these books because that's how to enjoy an artist's work.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's how to support an artist is buy something that they have made, with
Hmm.
love. So I
Yes.
think that is also a resource. Now, as a guitar player, I listen to a lot of um, artists and musicians talking about creativity. If you're not a guitar player, then there'll be something else you're interested in. Writers, people who write
Hmm.
fiction are creating, just in the same way as guitar players are making music, or drummers, or keyboard players, or pianists, or whatever. So I think my my advice on that is read stuff that inspires you. That
Hmm.
another one of my little favorite expressions is success is not the result of spontaneous combustion. You have to set yourself on fire. Um,
Yeah. Oh, I like
and,
that.
and, you know, reading someone who's passionate or watching a video about someone who's passionate about their creative process is like kindling for that fire.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's so for me, some of the great guitar players or musicians or lyricists or poets or writers, anybody. It can be people involved in natural history, videography. It can be anybody who's passionate about anything, archaeologists, cosmologists.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody is where I get more of my inspiration. And I think the biggest resource that we have as landscape photographers is the landscape.
Yeah.
Going into the landscape without a camera in your hand can be incredibly instructive.
What? No.
I know.
Yes, I know. What?
you
That's
know,
crazy.
a la Minor White, just
Yeah. Yeah.
it's going in there without a camera. And if you think
Yeah.
there's nothing to see in a landscape, leave your camera behind. And very, very quickly, it's, I wish I had my camera with me.
Ooh.
Look at all these amazing
Yes.
photographs I'm missing. So
Yep.
I
Yeah.
think, and this is why I just personally think that personal development is more important than creative development. I think if we focus
Mm.
on creative development, we're trying to fatten up the cart to go faster
Mm-hmm.
rather than
Mm-hmm.
training the horse. So I just made that up.
Nice.
That
Yeah,
seems to work.
that was really good. I like it. I immediately knew exactly what you meant. So
Right, cool. Stop whipping the cart and just Um, yeah. So I think that's key. Is that personal development is going to be so much more fruitful than trying to develop your creativity without a clear understanding of who you are.
yeah.
So I think the biggest resources are introspection, the landscape,
Mm-hmm.
and technique is probably a very, very, very low fifth or sixth on that list, I would
Yeah.
say.
Yeah. With gear being somewhere also down there, you're not
Yeah.
going to find your voice because you got a new lens. Um, it's,
Again, there can be catalysts. I mean, I just
yes.
got, I just
Yes,
got,
this is true.
I bought a 500 for my medium format
Mm.
system, and
Mm-hmm.
that just opened up a ton of opportunities for me again. So,
Yes.
equipment's equipment. It's like
Yeah.
guitars. I
Yeah.
mean, I've got six
Mm-hmm.
actually. And I don't need six guitars, but
But they're fun.
yeah,
They give you
and they
more
all do different
play.
things, and
They all
they're
do
all in
different
different
things.
tunings, and all of that type of
Yeah.
stuff. So yeah, you know,
Yeah.
it's play.
It's all play. So what platform, what place can people find you at the most to connect with you?
I I made a bit of a decision over the last few months that I am going to be spending less time on both social media and YouTube. YouTube is one of those things that the way that system works just demands these stupid clickbait titles, and I just refuse to play that game anymore. I want to make a
Mm-hmm.
video about something that I'm passionate about and I care about it. So the place that I really want to encourage people to connect with my work is through our website. So the website, and to join our newsletter. So if you could join our
Great.
newsletter, and I try to get 2 out a month,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not just buy this, buy that. I try to share little insights and things I've been thinking about, or thought-provoking things. It's that kindling that I talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
I try to provide
Yeah.
kindling a couple of
Nice.
times a month. So the newsletter would be the place that I would really encourage people to hook up with us. Instagram is probably the only place I still post images, but like once a week, maybe.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
I'm just not
Yeah.
one of these rabid 5 times a day posting on social media and photographing my breakfast and all of that. I have no interest in sharing that, and I'm sure people aren't even remotely interested in what I had for breakfast. So
We will make sure that everybody has access to those links in the show description. So
thank you.
please look below and let us know what your thoughts are on the questions I asked, the conversations, what Alister has shared, because this, I hope, is a conversation, not just
Totally. I don't feel
one
even
way.
remotely interrogated.
Good, good. Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure. I've been watching you for several years, and so it's a real gift to be able to speak to you and to know that this is one of the most excellent things that you've done today. So,
It
thanks for
is.
that gift.
You're more than welcome. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. I've really enjoyed myself.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Let us know in the comments what was most useful or meaningful to you, and be sure to subscribe so that you're notified of future episodes. This channel is made possible in part by Nature Photography classes and their Inspired Creator Grant. You can learn more or submit your own application at naturephotographyclasses.com/inspiredcreator. Thank you again so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.